shelter bobcat started crying when he recognized man standing in front of him. It began with a sound that didn't belong in a place like this. Not barking, not metal clanging, not the usual noise of a crowded animal shelter. It was something quieter, more human. A broken whimper, low and trembling, like it had been buried for too long. The kind of sound that makes you stop what you're doing without knowing why. That's what made Rebecca look up from her chart that morning, pen frozen mid-sentence. She didn't see anything unusual at first, just the hallway stretching long and gray, lined with cages and dimmed by the early light. But then she saw him. The bobcat. Pressed against the gate of his enclosure, muscles stiff, chest heaving like he couldn't quite catch his breath. His head was low, his golden eyes wide, not with fear but something deeper. Something like recognition. Just a few feet away, a man stood motionless, his hand resting gently on the cold steel bars that separated them. Neither of them moved. The hallway was completely still now. The dogs had gone silent, the staff frozen, as if everyone instinctively understood they were witnessing something they weren't supposed to interrupt. Rebecca took a step back, stunned by what she was seeing. The man wasn't speaking. He hadn't said a word since he walked in. But his eyes were full of something that didn't need explanation. Shock, heartbreak, and something dangerously close to hope. And the bobcat, he was crying. The sound he made didn't belong to the wild. It wasn't the cry of a trapped animal or a frightened one. It was a sound of grief, of remembering, of coming home. 12 days earlier, the same bobcat had been found just outside the pine woods, standing on the shoulder of an empty road at dawn. He hadn't run when the animal control officers pulled up. He hadn't fought when they approached. They expected chaos, but there was none. He let them load him into the crate without a single noise. And during the entire ride to the shelter, he simply sat, still, upright, watching the horizon as it disappeared behind him. They had no name to give him, no history, no chip, no collar. His coat was clean. His body strong. But his eyes were tired in a way that didn't match anything else. Tired like something had been taken from him. The staff called him Whisper. It wasn't official, just something that stuck. He didn't hiss or growl like the others. In fact, he barely made a sound. But when he moved, the world seemed to quiet down around him. No matter how loud the shelter got, how many barking dogs or slamming doors, there was always a kind of hush when he was near. He didn't behave like other rescues. He didn't act out or cower. He didn't pace or claw at the walls. Instead, he watched. Not the staff, not the ceiling, not the corners of his cage like most animals do when they're trapped. Whisper watched the front entrance. Every morning. He would rise just before the lights flickered on and sit at the edge of his pen, his body still, his gaze fixed. He never responded to food, never twitched at footsteps. He just waited. Quietly. As if expecting someone to walk through the door. Rebecca was the only one who truly noticed. While others rushed through routines and focused on numbers, she watched the way he seemed to prepare himself every morning. Like someone getting ready to see someone they hadn't seen in years. It made her wonder what he was remembering. Who he was missing. And that morning he found them. The man hadn't knocked. Hadn't signed in. Hadn't asked to see anyone. He had just walked through the shelter doors like he belonged there. He was older, his clothes worn, his hair touched with gray. But the moment he saw the bobcat at the end of the hall, he stopped. And something in him seemed to break. It didn't matter that years might have passed. It didn't matter that the cage stood between them or that neither could speak. They knew each other. You could feel it. The man stepped closer. Whisper didn't move away. He didn't growl or bare his teeth. He leaned in, slowly, cautiously, and pressed his head against the metal bars. Not out of habit. Not because he wanted food or attention. Because he needed that touch. Needed to remember. And the man, with eyes full of disbelief, pressed his forehead to the same spot. Rebecca had seen reunions before, between lost pets and their owners. There were always tears, always joy. But this wasn't that. This wasn't celebration. This was something far heavier. Like grief finding its way back to itself. Whisper made the sound again. That soft, aching whimper. One that said, "Where were you?" And maybe the man didn't answer out loud, but you could tell he heard it. You could tell it hurt. If you're still watching and already feeling something rise in your chest, maybe it's because you've known that kind of pain too, the kind that doesn't yell but waits in silence. If these moments matter to you, please like this video, subscribe to Critter Quest, and tap the bell icon. Because some stories don't need words to be remembered. They just need to be felt. By the time the shelter director arrived, the moment had already settled into something sacred. The man and the bobcat weren't moving. They didn't have to. Their stillness said everything. And as Rebecca quietly stepped away, she saw it. just below the bobcat's left eye, caught in the fur. A single tear. And somehow, she knew it wasn't the first. No one knew the man's name. He didn't offer it. Didn't ask questions. Didn't even glance at the paperwork they brought him. He just stood beside the cage like he had nowhere else to be. For hours he didn't speak. Just moved when Whisper moved, stepping closer when the bobcat leaned into the bars, sitting cross-legged when the animal curled into the corner. Not many people could sit still for that long, especially in a place like this. But he did. As if he'd been waiting for this moment longer than anyone understood. Some of the staff whispered, trying to guess who he was. An old owner, maybe? A volunteer from another town? Someone who raised Whisper from a cub and then lost him? But none of those stories quite fit. Because when the man finally looked up and asked one question, it wasn't the one they expected. Where did they find him? His voice was low, careful, as if each word had weight. Rebecca showed him the intake report. Whisper had been picked up just outside Pine Hollow, about 30 miles west. Near the ridge trail that no one used anymore, where the forest had begun taking things back. The man stared at the location circled in red and didn't blink for a long time. Then he nodded. Like something inside him finally confirmed what he already knew. Later that evening, long after most of the staff had left, Rebecca returned to check on the animals. The lights were dimmed for the night, a low hum rising from the heating vents. Most of the dogs were already asleep, but Whisper was still awake, still pressed near the front of his cage. And the man was still there. He hadn't left. Hadn't asked for food. Hadn't even touched his phone. He just sat on the floor like it was the most natural thing in the world. What's his story? Rebecca asked gently, keeping her voice soft so the others wouldn't hear. The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached into his coat and pulled out something small, folded, worn, the edges curled from years of being opened and closed. He handed it to her wordlessly. It was a photograph. 2 figures stood near a clearing in the woods. A younger man, taller, smiling. And at his side, unmistakable even through the grain of the print, was a bobcat. Slimmer. Younger. But the same golden coat. The same quiet eyes. The same animal. You raised him, she whispered. Still, the man didn't answer. He just took the photo back and stared down at the floor like the memory was too heavy to hold. Rebecca didn't push. Some people carry their grief like silence. Some stories are told more clearly in what's left unsaid. The next morning, Whisper was different. Not in any way the shelter could record. He didn't growl or pace or act out, but his posture had changed. Softer. More at ease. Like something heavy had lifted. And when the man arrived, he stood before the gate not as if he were searching anymore, but waiting. There was one thing that caught Rebecca's eye that morning. Whisper was no longer watching the entrance. He was watching the man. That afternoon, while restocking the medical cabinet near the back kennels, Rebecca noticed something else. Something that didn't sit right. She pulled the intake report again, rereading the field notes about where Whisper had been found. She remembered it clearly, near Pine Hollow Ridge. But now the report said something else. Hillside Edge, South Route, Route 18. Not the Ridge Trail. Not even close. She double-checked the intake log. Different handwriting. Different timestamp. But the same date. Someone had changed the record. She went to the security desk and asked to see the body cam clip from animal control that day, standard protocol footage. The clip was only 27 seconds long, and the video was oddly shaky. It showed Whisper sitting calmly in the road, trees behind him. But there were no hills in the background. Just pines. Tall and silent. It was Pine Hollow. No doubt about it. So why did the record say otherwise? She thought about telling the director. But something stopped her. A quiet feeling she couldn't explain. Not fear. Not suspicion. Something else. Like whatever Whisper had gone through before arriving here, someone didn't want him found. That evening the man came back again. Always the same, no questions, no fanfare. Just quiet presence. Rebecca brought a chair this time and sat near him just a few feet back. Whisper was curled in the corner of his enclosure, blinking slowly, almost dozing. But the moment the man whispered his name, not loud, not firm, just once, Whisper lifted his head. He didn't rush forward. He stood slowly, stretched, then padded to the bars and sat. Face to face. Man and Bobcat. There was something in the way they looked at each other, something not just shared but understood. As if they'd once survived the same winter. As if one had waited in the dark and the other had finally come back for him. Rebecca watched quietly, the file still in her lap. Whisper had been found in one place, but listed from another. And whoever this man was, he wasn't confused. He was remembering. He wasn't confused. He was remembering. That evening the shelter felt different. The kind of stillness that comes just before a season shifts. When the air changes without asking and you only notice because something in your chest tightens. Rebecca walked the halls slower than usual, clipboard forgotten, her mind circling the truth like a hawk overhead. The man, David she now knew, had returned once again and Whisper was already waiting. Not standing this time, not pacing. Just sitting at the gate of his enclosure, calm, alert, his eyes already fixed on the place where David would appear. And when he did, it was as if neither of them were surprised. Not even a blink. Like it had all already happened and they were just catching up to the moment. Rebecca didn't speak. She simply watched. Some things were too fragile to disturb. David lowered himself to the floor beside the cage, cross-legged like always, and Whisper leaned forward, nose just an inch from the bars. Their silence felt sacred. Not empty but full. Like two halves of a story that had finally been placed beside each other again after years of being lost in different books. Rebecca stepped away quietly and made her way to the staff office. She didn't mean to snoop, not really, but something had begun scratching at the edges of her conscience. She remembered the altered intake report, the new location, the mismatched handwriting. That wasn't just a clerical error. That was intent. She pulled the folder again and stared at the updated field log, Hillside Edge, Route 18. But she already knew that wasn't where Whisper had been found. The original body cam footage told the truth. Pine Hollow, 30 miles west, deep in the old woods where few people ventured anymore. A place more memory than map. Her fingers hesitated, then moved toward the old voicemail archive, where shelter calls were stored from the past 30 days. Most were routine. Lost dogs, adoption appointments, wildlife sightings. But one caught her attention. Dated the night before Whisper arrived. From a number that had been blocked. She clicked play. A man's voice. Muffled. Urgent. There's a wildcat near the Hollow Road. Looks injured. Could be dangerous. Someone should come quick. Don't say my name. Click. That was it. Rebecca leaned back in her chair, skin prickling. The call had come from someone who didn't want to be found. Someone who didn't want to admit they had seen Whisper. Or heard him. She looked again at the folder. At the crossed-out location. At the lazy handwriting clearly added after the fact. Someone had tried to move Whisper's story. Rewrite where he was found, maybe to cover their tracks. Maybe to separate him from someone who might come looking. Someone like David. She glanced through the office window, saw the outline of David still sitting on the floor, Whisper just inches from his side. There was a kind of peace there, yes. But underneath it, there was something else too. Something unsettled. The next morning, David arrived before the shelter even opened. Rebecca was there early too, unable to sleep, the weight of what she'd uncovered still sitting behind her ribs like a stone. David nodded in quiet greeting, then walked to Whisper's enclosure. This time, instead of sitting, he stood still, hands in the pockets of his jacket. Whisper rose from his resting spot and stepped forward, tail low, shoulders smooth with trust. He didn't flinch when David reached into his coat. Rebecca, watching from the end of the hall, stiffened. But David didn't pull out anything dangerous. Just a piece of cloth. It was old, worn at the corners. Faded from sun and time. But even from where she stood, Rebecca could make out the shape of it. A scarf. And not just any scarf. One with pine trees stitched into the fabric. Whisper sniffed the air, then the cloth. And then he made a noise, a soft exhale, low and unguarded. Not a cry. Not a growl. A sound like recognition. Rebecca stepped forward, unable to help herself. That belonged to you? She asked. David didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the Bobcat. It was his, he said. When he was young. I used to tie it to his bed so he'd know it was his space. Safe. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was reverent. Like the forest before snowfall. Rebecca didn't press. But something inside her was shifting. The man before her wasn't just some former caretaker or forest wanderer. He was part of Whisper's story in a way no file or report could ever capture. And yet, the broken record, the false location, the anonymous voicemail. It all pointed to one truth. Someone had taken Whisper on purpose. And someone didn't want him found. Later that afternoon, Rebecca returned to the enclosure to leave food. Whisper hadn't been eating much, but he accepted what David offered, little pieces from the man's hand as if trusting no one else. As she crouched near the gate, she caught a glimpse of something on Whisper's neck. Hidden under fur, almost invisible. A faint scar. Long thin. A collar mark. Not a shelter collar. Not a wildlife tag. Something else. Tighter. Older. Her breath caught. Whisper had been restrained once. Not just contained but owned. David noticed her gaze and looked away. Rebecca said nothing. But that night, after the lights dimmed and the animals quieted, she sat with the folder in her lap for a long time. She flipped through every page, every detail of Whisper's short file. Then she pulled a blank report from the drawer and began writing a new one that told the truth. The pen moved slowly in her hand, each letter carefully formed, as if the words themselves needed to be spoken with reverence. She didn't correct the old report, she left it intact, tucked behind the new one. But this second file, she signed with her own name at the bottom. Her own handwriting. Her own eyes bearing witness. Location found, Pine Hollow Ridge. Behavior, calm, unafraid. Not feral. Notable detail, showed signs of prior human bonding. Possibly hand-raised. Evidence of restraint scarring at the neck. Rebecca placed the new report into a fresh folder. Labeled it with the same name everyone in the shelter had come to know him by. Whisper. She slid the folder into the locked drawer, not in defiance of protocol, but in quiet protest against something she couldn't quite name. Against whatever silence had tried to bury this bobcat's truth. That night she dreamed of forests. But not peaceful ones. These trees were too quiet. So, like something had happened there once, and the trees remembered. The next morning, a light snow had dusted the ground outside. Early for the season. The shelter buzzed with its usual noise, doors slamming, buckets clattering, dogs barking into the ceiling, but near the end of the corridor it was still. Whisper sat at the front of his enclosure, not tense, not tired. Waiting. And when David stepped in through the main doors, his face softened the moment their eyes met. Rebecca was there early, sweeping the corridor floor. She paused as David passed her. "He remembers more than we think," she said gently. David nodded. "So do I." She wanted to ask what that meant, but something in his expression made her hold back. It was the look of a man carrying pieces of something shattered long ago. Not just grief. Not just guilt. Memory. As he crouched down beside Whisper's cage, he pulled something new from his coat pocket. A roll of aged paper tied with twine. He unrolled it slowly, laying it on the floor for Whisper to see. Rebecca came closer, careful not to intrude. It was a hand-drawn map. Faded. Parts torn or smudged. But the shape was clear. Ridges, rivers, a winding forest path marked with small red symbols. Near the center, circled 3 times in black ink, was a clearing. David tapped it with one finger. "This is where he was born." Rebecca blinked. "You were there?" "I built a shelter for him. Off-grid. Far from the roads. No one knew. Not even the rangers. He didn't look up. I raised him there until they found us." A long silence followed. Rebecca felt her chest tighten. "Who?" David's jaw moved, then stilled. "People who don't think animals like him should be loved." He didn't say more. He didn't need to. Whisper had turned away from the bars now, curling into himself. But not from fear. From something quieter. From remembering too much. Later that day, the shelter director called a surprise meeting. Rebecca, wiping her hands on her scrubs, arrived last, finding the room already full. The director, clipboard in hand, looked around the circle of tired staff with a look that made her uneasy. "We've received a request from State Wildlife Control," she began. "They've reviewed our intake reports and there's been a flag." Rebecca's stomach dropped. "They claim the bobcat we have, Whisper, matches the description of an illegally raised wildcat tied to an open investigation from 4 years ago. They're sending someone to evaluate. If the match is confirmed, he'll be taken." The room filled with quiet murmurs. Someone whispered, "He doesn't act wild. He acts trained." Rebecca didn't speak. Her hand instinctively drifted toward the key in her pocket, the one to the drawer where she had locked the second file. The real one. She didn't know what terrified her more, that someone wanted to take Whisper, or that someone had been watching long enough to know exactly where to find him. That night, Rebecca stayed late. David hadn't shown up that day. For the first time in over a week. The staff assumed he had given up. Or been warned. But Rebecca had seen something else in his eyes the day before. Resolve. And she didn't believe for a second he'd walk away now. She made rounds quietly, stopping at Whisper's cage. He wasn't pacing. He wasn't crying. He was waiting. She crouched near the bars and whispered, "He's coming back. Isn't he?" Whisper didn't move. But in the stillness she felt it. That same shift in the air. Like winter arriving behind a whisper. Like something old and deep turning toward the light again. She stayed near the enclosure for a long while, sitting on the cold concrete with her back to the wall, knees tucked in, clipboard forgotten at her side. The shelter around her carried on, distant voices, the hum of machines, the rustle of restless animals, but none of it reached where she was. Not tonight. Tonight, everything had narrowed down to one truth. If David didn't come back soon, it might be too late. And if he did, he'd have to fight more than memory to keep Whisper from being taken again. The next morning, before the sun had even touched the rooftops, the knock came. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Rebecca was already awake, sitting in her car outside the shelter with her coffee untouched. When she saw the dark vehicle pull into the lot, unmarked, clean, deliberate, she knew. Two figures stepped out. One wore a state-issued vest. The other, a plain coat with no badge at all. That was the one who didn't need to show credentials. The kind that got called when decisions were already made. They didn't glance at her. Just walked straight through the door. Inside, the shelter stirred as it always did. Lights humming awake, dogs stretching and barking, steel doors squealing open. But the weight in the air was heavier today. Something unspoken moved through the halls. Rebecca followed them quietly. They didn't ask where Whisper was. They already knew. When they reached the enclosure, Whisper was already standing. Not startled. Not afraid. Alert. His eyes found the taller man first, the one in the coat, and held. Not with recognition. Not with trust. But with something sharp. Watchful. Like he remembered this kind of gaze. The kind that never meant well. The officer pulled a small device from her pocket. A scanner. She stepped forward. If he has a chip, we'll find it. Rebecca's voice came without her permission. He doesn't. The officer glanced at her. You're sure? He was scanned when he came in. Twice. No chip. The taller man crouched near the bars now. Not close enough to touch. Just close enough to be felt. Sometimes animals carry more than chips, he said softly. Sometimes they carry stories. Whisper didn't move. But his body was tense. Every muscle silent, still but ready. David hadn't come. That was all Rebecca could think. Where was he? Why wasn't he here? The officer stood. We'll need to transport him to the district wildlife facility for evaluation. If he's found to have been raised illegally, he'll be classified non-releasable. Rebecca felt the words like ice on her skin. Non-releasable. That meant confinement. A sanctuary if he was lucky. A cage forever if he wasn't. Or worse. She looked at Whisper, who still hadn't moved, but whose gaze was now locked on her. As if he could sense something slipping. As if asking quietly, will you let them take me again? And then, from the far end of the hallway, a voice. Not loud. Not rushed. But unshakably firm. You're not taking him. All three turned. David stood in the corridor, coat dusted with snow, boots wet from the frost. He looked older than he had the day before. Tired. But his eyes were alive. Focused. He walked forward slowly. No anger. Just wait. The officer stepped back. Sir, this is a legal matter. We have jurisdiction. David ignored her. He kept his eyes on the man in the coat. You tried to bury him once, he said quietly. You won't do it again. Rebecca could feel the temperature drop. Not in the air. In the silence. The man straightened, his expression unreadable. He was removed for a reason. You broke the law. I broke silence, David replied. I gave a life a place to belong. You call that illegal. I call it necessary. The man turned toward the officer. Prepare the carrier. Rebecca stepped between them before she knew what she was doing. No, she said. You don't have updated records. You don't have proof of origin. And he's not chipped. You're acting on assumption. Not authority. They stared at her like she'd grown claws. But she didn't back down. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the new file. The one she'd written by hand. With her name. Her responsibility. I have a second intake report. The first was tampered with. The location was changed after arrival. I have body cam footage and the original timestamp. He was found in Pine Hollow, not Hillside. That matters. The officer took the file slowly, reading the top line. Rebecca watched her face shift as she reached the part about the scar. The behavior. The scarf. The man in the coat didn't move. But something in him had cracked. David spoke again. Softer now. You're not here for him. You're here because his freedom is inconvenient. The man stepped back. You'll be hearing from us. And then they left. No shouting. No final words. Just footsteps and cold air. Rebecca's knees nearly gave out when the door shut. She turned to Whisper. He was still standing. But now his body eased just slightly. A breath loosed. attention broken. And then David crouched near him again, pressing his forehead to the bars. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "They found you because I waited too long." Whisper made a sound then. Not the soft whimper from before. Not grief. A low, deep vibration. Almost a purr. It didn't belong in a shelter. It didn't belong in any textbook. But it belonged here. With him. With David. That night, Rebecca stayed late again. Not out of duty. But because something sacred had passed through the building that day. Something unshakable. She walked the corridor slowly, letting her hand brush the walls, the cold steel of the gates. And when she reached Whisper's cage, she found him not at the front this time, but curled in the back corner, eyes closed, breathing slow. Sleeping. Truly, finally sleeping. The man who raised him sat just a few feet away. Silent. Watching over him like he had always done. And outside, the snow kept falling, quiet, soft, unnoticed. Like time itself had chosen to stop for a while. Just long enough for two lives to find each other again. The snow melted slowly over the next few days. Not all at once, but in patches, like the land itself was remembering how to breathe again. The world outside the shelter began to shift. Light returned earlier. The wind softened. Even the dogs barked less. But inside the quietest corner of the building, nothing moved faster than it had to. Whisper had stopped watching the door. He no longer sat at the edge of his enclosure waiting for footsteps or ghosts. He slept deeper now. More. Stretched into the sunlight without flinching. It wasn't joy. Not yet. But it was healing. And that was enough. David came every day just like before. But something about him had changed too. The weight he carried no longer bent him. He sat straighter. Smiled more, though never for long. He didn't talk much, but when he did, it was softer than before. Like he was speaking into a place that finally heard him. Rebecca noticed the difference, not just in the man but in the room around him. The air felt clearer when he was near. Whisper would uncurl at the sound of his boots, not because he feared being taken, but because he knew he wasn't alone anymore. And then one morning a decision was made. It wasn't official at first. Not on paper. Not with signatures or stamps. It began with a conversation in the staff room, over cold coffee and quiet resolve. "He's not property," Rebecca said. "He's not evidence." The director looked at her across the table, tired but not unkind. "They'll try to fight it. Then let them," she said. "He belongs where he remembers who he is. And that's not behind a gate." The next week unfolded like a plan whispered into place. A wildlife specialist came down from the northern office. An older woman with soft hands and a deeper understanding of things not written in manuals. She observed Whisper for 3 days, silently, patiently. Then she closed her notebook and said the words no one expected. "He's ready." Rebecca's throat tightened. "For what?" The woman smiled. "To go home." They chose a stretch of protected land outside Pine Hollow. Not the old forest, not where the past might still ache, but a nearby valley, where water ran clean and deer moved like ghosts through the trees. It was close enough to remember but far enough to begin again. David went first. He built a small shelter there. Not a cage, just a structure with no door. A place to rest, to watch the wind, to listen to the forest. He cleared a trail wide enough for Whisper's cautious steps, scattered pine needles like breadcrumbs. He didn't mark the path. He didn't need to. Whisper would know the way. And then, on a morning dipped in gold and birdsong, the cage door opened. No ceremony. No applause. Just the sound of the latch sliding free. Whisper didn't rush. He stepped forward slowly, one paw at a time, feeling the ground. Smelling the air. Looking not with fear but with understanding. Rebecca stood beside David, breath held. For a moment, Whisper turned back. Not toward the enclosure but toward them. Not as a question. As a thank you. Then he walked forward, into the tall grass, into the pine, into the life that had waited for him. Weeks passed. The shelter returned to its rhythm. Animals came and went. People adopted. People forgot. But Rebecca didn't forget. Sometimes in the quietest hours of the morning she would open Whisper's folder, not the original one but the one she wrote, and run her fingers over the name. Not his species. Not his age. Just the one word. Whisper. And somewhere deep in Pine Hollow, a trail stayed clear. A shelter stayed open. A man sat on a rock at the edge of a quiet stream, eyes on the horizon. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Because sometimes, in the rustle of branches or the faintest crack of twigs behind him, he could feel it. A presence. A memory. A soft breath close by. And every so often if you happened to pass through that valley just after sunrise you might see it too. A figure in the trees, gold and gray, low to the earth, eyes sharp, unblinking, watching, not lost, not waiting, but home.